What made the Jasper wildfire in 2024 so devastating? In this podcast, I go over the Jasper wildfire complex fire behavior documentation, reconstruction, and analysis that was published by the Canadian Forest Service. Welcome to the Hazardscape podcast, where we discuss Indigenous emergency management as our small contribution to enhancing Indigenous community public safety in our efforts to reconcile the relationship between the Crown and all nations. You can access this report online. It's publicly available. Canadian Forest Service recently released this report on analyzing the fire behavior, progression, and the environmental factors that drove the Jasper fire. And really what happened was it was ignited by multiple lightning strikes on the night of July 22nd, 2024 in the upper Athabasca Valley within Jasper National Park. And what is nutty about this wildfire is how fast it grew, right? It destroyed 358 structures, and it forced the evacuation of 25,000 people. So the Canadian Forest Service undertook this. They kind of like reconstructed the fire behavior over a 50-hour period, sort of integrating what they saw, what was seen on the ground, satellite images, and then interviews with fire personnel and the other modeling that they had at the time. And like, before I get into the real technical stuff, I want to recognize Alberta firefighter Morgan Kitchen, who passed during the fire, right? He passed away on August 3rd, 2024. And, you know, his sacrifice and so many others, like, it underscores the gravity of what first responders and community members face with these things, right? Losing a life during a response is horrific. And so many Indigenous people they don't necessarily pass during the evacuation, but a lot of them pass weeks to months to years after evacuation due to, you know, mental health. I have a friend who lost her brother. He passed away waiting to be evacuated in an air hangar because he was just sitting alone and nobody saw him. And you have experienced any kind of mental health issues, if you haven't heard of the Hope for Wellness, I'll just put it up here right now so you can see it as a resource. There is a Hope for Wellness helpline. I don't know what the uptake is in it, but it is available for Indigenous people across Canada. You can see the phone number right there. So spread that, pass that around if you need. I'll do that a little bit there. We'll leave that on. Because I don't want anyone, if they're listening, to get triggered by, if they are triggered by this kind of overview, it's important you can get that help. So I'm going to go on with the story here. This was a compounding wildfire. And when we talk about climate change and when we talk about, what I call extreme or super hazards, it's because there's so many compounding effects. And the big compounding effect here for the Jasper fire was that fire exclusion policies led to really dense continuous forests. Like, this increase of fuel connectivity, it created what some would call maybe a fuel highway. And it aligned with the valley winds, which is what facilitated the rapid fire spread. Okay. And there's then the mountain pine beetle outbreak, which peaked 9 years ago in 2017. Most of the affected tree stands were in what they call the gray attack stage, meaning they had lost all of their foliage, their needles, but retained their branch structures of the trees. So you know what that does when the trees lose their foliage, right? What happens? I mean, that all falls to the ground. It creates more fuel. Then it also allows increased solar radiation and wind penetration at the forest floor. So it dries out the surface and the fuel way faster than if all that foliage would have been there to protect from the sunlight. Plus, you have dead, standing, and downed sort of woody fuels. And from the pine beetle mortality, it greatly increased that fuel loading and fire intensity potential through that time period, right? Following the peak in 2017. So the report estimates that the fuel consumption and fire intensities were 2 to 3 times higher than in sort of an unaffected green forest, which is a massive amplification of fire behavior potential. And the fuel treatments around Jasper, primarily mechanical thinning, so meaning, just doing it by hand, by doing it with heavy equipment. Since 2003, it aimed to reduce the crown fire potential by breaking that fuel continuity and removing dead trees. But despite all of that, the fire still caused, a lot of damage, 358 structures. So let's move to the fire weather in 2024, because that fire season started with, a very a below average snowpack. Again, prolonged drought, which I've shown on here multiple times. There was a heat wave, right, in June and July. And the fire weather index system showed extreme drying. So the fine fuel moisture code values reached kind of like the mid 90s. And that buildup index exceeded 160, which was the highest on record for that time of the year in the Jasper region. Okay, so that's super high. And to account for additional drying, it kind of, with the canopy loss, that increased the drought by about 38% at the forest floor, okay? Which is, that's a big adjustment, showing just how insects like the mountain pine beetle can exacerbate fire weather impacts. There wasn't a lot of wind during the fire. There was some light surface winds during much of the fire, but higher elevation stations kind of showed stronger wind gusts. And so the complex mountain meteorology, really including that valley channeling and upslope of the winds, influence fire speed. And I'm going to go into a little bit later in this talking about kind of the tornadoes that happened in the fire, which is common through, these big sort of wildland fires creating their own wind patterns. So, except for the initial thunderstorm that caused the lightning strike, there was some atmospheric instability, but it was really not a big deal. And speaking of those ignitions, on July 2nd, those lightning strikes were within 6 kilometers of each other. So those lightning strike sites merged together into what was called the Jasper South Fire. And within 10 minutes, there was crown fire activity, meaning the fires had gone from the forest floor to the tops of the forest trees, which that whenever you see a crown fire indicates extreme fire behavior beyond what wildland fire can suppress right on the ground. So that it happens super fast. And the fire grew rapidly, like over 3,500 hectares within 4 hours. And it spread about 23 kilometers north toward Jasper over 50 hours. So you've got to think about a fire, moving 23 kilometers over 50 hours. That's just 2 days. And then there was a fourth ignition north of the fire. It occurred closer to Jasper, but it didn't cause or get into too much of cause much of the damage. So the fire exhibited like a very severe to extreme behavior, with flame heights exceeding 30 meters, right? And intense crown fire spread. So if you think about 30 meters, it's almost 3 stories. And it was also influenced by some overnight burning that was sustained through drought, because typically at night fires don't burn as quickly. But because of the drought and fuel conditions, this fire really deviated from those typical fire patterns. And that's important to note because, like I said, because fire activity drops overnight because it gets cooler, it usually gets a little bit more humid. But here the drought and fuel conditions like allowed for sustained burning through the night. And at least for Parks Canada and Alberta Wildfire, I don't think in 2024 they had night firefighting capability. Mostly wildland firefighters nowadays do not have much night activity or firefighting. That is changing thanks to Indigenous-led programs, because back in the day, if you talk to old school wildland firefighters, Indigenous, especially First Nations, they will tell you they used to camp overnight out near the fire, right? So they could prepare for the morning and be ready. They're starting to do that a little bit more, but I think back in 2024, that was not the case. If you have any questions, please throw them in the comments. Share this if you think somebody else might be interested in this story we're talking about. And, the fast spread like mainly occurred on the afternoon of the 24th, which also coincided with like a convection column collapse near the tree line. And that confluence was at the Athabasca and Métis rivers. And that is kind of an interesting one because the fire exhibited this like plume-driven behavior, which is, characterized by what they call like towering convection columns, strong updrafts of wind, fire-induced winds, really. And it's a rotating smoke column. And that was observed on the afternoon. And that's indicative of like intense connective activity and overwhelming like ambient winds. And fire generated winds near that plume reached, okay, get this, 200 kilometers per hour. Right? That is the same wind speed and gives similar patterns to an F4 to F5 tornado. All right. So you have to think that while this big intense fire is going on, there is like an F4, F5, 200 kilometer an hour cyclone of wind blowing and fanning the fire. Even though just slightly away from there, the ground surface, like winds never got up to more than like 20, 25 kilometers an hour on the ground. So around 5:30 p.m. that evening, the convection column collapsed near the tree line in the junction of the Athabasca and Miette valleys, and it produced a downburst and strong short-lived like surface winds that hit 110 kilometers per hour and really, really thick ground level smoke over the Jasper town site. So as that column collapsed, it just brought all the surface winds, 110 kilometers an hour, all that smoke, boom, right into the Jasper town site. And that downburst also very highly likely distributed embers for more than 2 kilometers into the town of Jasper, igniting like a lot of spot fires, initiating structure ignitions. And so the dynamics of column collapse, like from what the report says, it's not well understood and not well represented in current fire behavior or modeling. So really what they're saying is those columns that produce like the F4, F5 tornado winds, they're really hard to model and predict. So, trying to factor that into your response is tricky. All right. Damage assessments included overturned steel containers, uprooted trees, which were used to estimate the wind speeds. And so for example, like a recycling bin was blown over, like, those big blue containers, estimated at 170 kilometers per hour. Even large shipping containers, which, they'll tell you they tip, when with winds exceeding 210 kilometers per hour to kind of tip them. So that's wild. And it really shows the extreme localized wind forces that were generated by the fire itself. So if you can think of like yourself as an evacuee being exposed to that, if they delay the evacuation, right, and you're in that, it's just mind-blowing. So kind of sticking on to the wind, the surface winds, the report did talk about the surface winds were low, between 3 and 10 clicks an hour. But despite that, there was still massive fire activity. And this discrepancy reported highlights the role of fire-induced winds and those complex vertical wind profiles in accelerating fire spread beyond what service measurements suggest. So, really important. There are software tools. There is AI out there that, like to say that they can predict wildfire behavior, but they use data that's measured through typical means. They're not measuring data in these complex wildfire plumes, which means their models could be way off, right? And communities, on reserve emergency management coordinators, chief and councils, everyone involved have to understand that even though they're getting data and information from the government on these models, there's still a lot that isn't known that's going on, right? So that's why it's so important for like land guardians, fire guardians, elders who know the land, inch by inch, be involved in planning, modeling, and discussions, right? So important. And the rates of spread during the fire's peak exceeded predictions from the Canadian Fire Behavior Prediction System, right? They have a model, they have a standard. This exceeded those predictions. And this goes back to something that I've been talking to colleagues with for the last decade, is we don't exercise worst case scenarios well enough. If you're really interested in this topic, like and share so, others can find it like you. And if there is anything that is triggering in this, the Hope for Wellness page is up there with the number. So continuing on here, instead of like observed rates of speed aligned more closely with models, right, for highly flammable complexes like dead balsam fir, mixed wood, or dense boreal pine spruce stands, right? Even those models don't fully capture the plume-driven wild, like the fire behavior from those winds. And so operational fire behavior models don't adequately represent these very complex interactions, which limits their ability to predict. And we know mechanical fuel treatments that were done around Jasper between 2023 to 2022, like they focused on thinning and removal of dead trees to reduce crown fire potential, right? A rapid assessment showed that there was significantly lower crown fraction burned and the kind of the bowl HR heights in treat areas compared to untreated. Those recent treatments, those less than 10 years old, were more effective than older treatments in moderating fire behavior. So they've really got to keep those treatments up, right? Treated areas also experienced lower fire severity, which makes sense, and reduced crown fire involvement. So where they did do mechanical wildland treatments did, limit structure exposure and improved fire safety. So that's why Fire Smart is so important. Oh, Fire Smart, Fire Smart, Fire Smart. But again, despite these treatments, fire still caused significant damage, highlighting that fuel management is only one component of a broader resilience strategy. And the report emphasizes that wildfire disasters result from a sequence of issues: severe wildfire potential, extreme burning conditions, multiple ignitions or flammable structures, overwhelmed suppression resources, mountain pine beetle impacts. So that's why when we talk about enhancing community resilience, landscape risk assessment, fuel management, fire resistant construction, fire suppression planning, all really part of a system meant to protect the community. And this one represents like that increasing challenge of managing these extreme wildland fires, especially in mountain terrains. Okay. And, this is just one good example, and it underscores like the need for integrated, multifaceted approaches to wildfire management, including cultural burning practices. There's no single solution, but it requires a very integrated system. So that's the Jasper Wildfire Report, Wildfire Management Overview. It's a very good, detailed report. There's a lot of technical jargon in it, but if you can kind of educate yourself on some terminology, understand what the paper is saying, incorporate that into your risk assessment, your emergency management planning, then you can increase your resilience, be better prepared, right? And those are the, what I'm going to do on our Patreon is that briefing. What I've done is that report, we've kind of put it down into a briefing for like chief and council level, emergency management coordinator level, so they don't have to read through the report all themselves and try and understand it. We've summarized it into some key highlights like I just read through. And so they can at least get the highlighted bullets of it, right? Because they don't, unless chief and council want to dig into it, all the technical stuff, they don't have to. They just need to know some of the high risks and some of the themes from it. Thanks for joining us at Hazardscape. You can subscribe to our YouTube and find our ad-free training videos by becoming a supporter on Patreon with a network of other Indigenous peoples looking to make their communities safer. And remember, know your hazardscape and be prepared.